Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy just delivered his most defiant message yet, and it's aimed directly at Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
I want to go straight to Vaughn Hilliard, who's standing by for us on this. Listen, potential direct talks. You cannot overstate how incredible it is between the President of the United States and the President of Russia meeting to speak, of course, about the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia in Alaska next week. What will come of it, I think, is the key question here, Vaughn.
Right. Yasmin, this is just in literally the last few moments here.
As the two superpowers prepare to meet in Alaska this Friday, Zelenskyy is making one thing crystal clear. Ukraine will not be sidelined, and Ukraine will not surrender its land.
Ukrainians will not give their land to the occupier. Ukraine is ready for real solutions that can bring peace. Solutions that are against us, solutions that are without Ukraine, are simultaneously solutions against peace. They will not achieve anything. These are dead solutions.
The Ukrainian president's firm stance comes at a critical moment. He has explicitly stated that Ukraine will not give Russia any awards for what it has done, and that Ukrainians will not give their land to the occupier. His message is unequivocal. Any decisions that are without Ukraine are at the same time decisions against peace. They will not bring anything. These are dead decisions. They will never work. We're talking about a high-stakes diplomatic showdown that could reshape the entire war in Ukraine, but Zelenskyy is calling it dead on arrival. So what exactly is happening behind the scenes? And why is Ukraine's president so convinced that this summit will achieve absolutely nothing? To understand this dramatic standoff, we need to break down what's really at stake here. The announcement came like a diplomatic thunderbolt.
In Alaska, it will be the first in-person meeting between leaders of the U.S. and Russia since Moscow launched its deadly 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Putin reportedly told U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff this week that he's willing to halt the war if Ukraine simply hands over the Donbass region in the eastern part of the country. Fred Fleitz served as former National Security Council Chief of Staff. He joins us now to react. Thank you, Fred, for joining us this morning. Do you have confidence that Putin is actually coming to negotiate, or is he trying to buy time?
I think
President Trump has announced a historic meeting with Vladimir Putin scheduled for Friday in Alaska, the first in-person meeting between U.S. and Russian leaders since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Putin has reportedly signaled willingness to halt the war if Ukraine hands over the Donbass region, moving from his previous position of wanting control of all regions along the front line to now focusing on Donetsk and Luhansk, areas Russia largely already controls. The location choice is symbolic and strategic. Alaska sits just miles from Russia across the Bering Strait, making it what officials call quite logical for such a summit. But the real bombshell wasn't where they'd meet, it was what Trump suggested they'd discuss. Trump made it clear that any peace deal would involve what he called some swapping of territories to the betterment of both countries.
nothing happened, and Putin notices that. But second, to the other point you made, it is always a gift to any leader in the world to sit down with the President of the United States of America. When I worked for President Obama and planned summits with Russian leaders and other countries, we always knew that this was something we were giving them, and we expected something in return. And what I think is wrong about this sequencing is I worry that Putin will get the gift. He'll get the gift of sitting next to the United States president in the United States of America, by the way, in Alaska, a part of the former Russian Empire, by the way, that some Russian nationalists still.
But as Ambassador Michael McFaul has pointed out, Trump is discussing swapping Ukrainian territory for Ukrainian territory, not Russian territory. If Trump announces territorial concessions to Putin, it would set back the peace process, not advance it. Let's be brutally honest about what this means. Ukraine currently controls only around 4 square miles of Russian territory in the Kursk region, territory they seized during their bold offensive last year, but have since lost most of through Russian counterattacks. Meanwhile, Russia controls approximately 1/5 of Ukraine's sovereign territory, including Crimea, which they illegally annexed in 2014, and significant portions of 4 eastern regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. So when Trump talks about swapping territories, the math is devastatingly clear. Ukraine would be giving up massive chunks of its homeland in exchange for tiny slivers of Russian land. This is where Zelenskyy drew his line in the sand.
Presidential reaction is what actually 3/4 of Ukrainians are thinking. There's been a recent survey showing that this is the amount of the Ukrainian population which do not want to broker a peace with Russia under Russia's condition, which would amount to giving up Ukrainian territories. And Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in his address, also stated what is constitutionally a fact here in Ukraine. I will quote him, the answer to the Ukrainian territorial question already is in the constitution of Ukraine. Giving up Ukrainian territory if Kyiv gave up that territory, that would amount to violating the Ukrainian constitution, violating the country's very own sovereignty. It is not something that Ukraine is ready to do. If it were,
the reality on the ground in Ukraine tells a powerful story. 75% of Ukrainians oppose any peace deal involving territorial concessions to Russia. Ceding territory would violate Ukraine's constitution and sovereignty, requiring approval from the Ukrainian population who are not willing to make such concessions. The disconnect between potential Washington-Moscow talks and Ukrainian territorial integrity couldn't be more stark. In a statement posted to Telegram that reverberated around the world, Ukraine's president didn't mince words. Zelensky's reaction reflects deep Ukrainian anxieties about being marginalized in discussions about their own future. For over 3 years, Ukraine has been fighting for its survival, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians in the process. The idea that 2 foreign leaders, even allies, would sit down and carve up Ukrainian territory without Ukrainian representation at the table strikes at the heart of what this war has been about. Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign, independent nation. But there's more to this story than just Ukrainian defiance. Behind the scenes, a complex diplomatic drama has been unfolding that reveals just how much pressure is building for a resolution.
Published a definitive editorial saying no one should remain alive in Ukraine. So the idea of Ukrainian destruction is still part of the Russian conversation and debate, and there isn't really any evidence that they have withdrawn from that. I mean, I think the second thing to say is that the history of Russian negotiations, if you look at the previous negotiations in a previous era after the 2014 invasion, is that the Russians like to use negotiations to prolong things, to draw it out, to prevent sanctions, to prevent things from getting worse. And I worry that President Trump's team might, as Ambassador McFaul just said, might want some quick deal, and they will not see that this is part of Russia's longer strategy.
Russia historically uses negotiations to prolong conflicts and prevent sanctions rather than seeking genuine resolution. Putin has never publicly abandoned his goal of destroying Ukraine, with Russian state media recently publishing extreme rhetoric. There's genuine concern that Trump's team might rush into a quick deal without understanding Russia's longer-term strategy of potentially pausing the war only to restart it later. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, spent 3 hours in Moscow this week meeting with Putin. That meeting produced what Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the first concrete proposal from Russia about what they would actually accept to end the war. The details of Putin's plan are as stark as they are controversial. According to Western officials briefed on the matter, Putin's proposal would require Ukraine to cede the entire eastern Donbas region, the industrial heartland that has been partially occupied since 2014 and has seen some of the war's most brutal fighting. The plan would also formalize Russian control over Crimea, which Moscow has controlled since its illegal annexation over a decade ago. In exchange, Russia would freeze the current battle lines and stop its offensive operations. But here's the catch. The plan offers no meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine and would essentially reward Putin's aggression by giving him permanent control over conquered territory. European leaders are just as alarmed as Zelenskyy. In a An unprecedented show of unity, the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, Poland, the United Kingdom, Finland, and the European Union issued a joint statement that reads like a diplomatic intervention. They welcomed Trump's efforts to achieve peace but made their conditions crystal clear. Any diplomatic settlement must protect Ukraine's and Europe's vital security interests and include robust and credible security guarantees that enable Ukraine to effectively defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The European statement reveals the deeper geopolitical tensions at play. European leaders are terrified that Trump and Putin might gang up to impose terms on Ukraine that would essentially legitimize Putin's conquest through force. As one European official put it bluntly, official recognition of territory conquered by force without a cost is an incentive to do more in the future. It could incentivize Russia to do more attacks on Ukraine again in a few years. This fear isn't just theoretical, it's based on Putin's own track record. The Russian leader has a pattern of taking territory, consolidating control, and then launching new offensives when he feels strong enough. Crimea in 2014 was followed by the broader invasion in 2022. European leaders worry that accepting Putin's current territorial gains would just give him time to regroup and prepare for the next phase of expansion. Meanwhile, the White House is trying to manage multiple competing pressures. While Trump announced the bilateral meeting with Putin, officials say he remains open to a trilateral summit that would include Zelenskyy. But the current format, a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin, is exactly what Russia has been pushing for and what Ukraine and Europe have been trying to avoid. It creates the appearance that Ukraine's fate is being decided by others, which undermines the very principle that Ukraine is fighting for: the right to determine its own future. The timing of this summit is also crucial. Trump had set Friday as his deadline for Putin to agree to peace talks or face severe economic punishment, including additional sanctions and secondary tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. The fact that the summit is happening on that exact deadline suggests Putin may have calculated that offering this meeting and his territorial demands would be enough to avoid those threatened consequences. But Zelensky's rejection of the summit's premise creates a massive problem for any potential deal. Ukraine's constitution enshrines the country's territorial integrity as non-negotiable. Zelenskyy has repeatedly emphasized that lasting peace must include Ukraine's voice at the table. Without Ukrainian buy-in, any agreement between Trump and Putin would be, as Zelenskyy put it, dead on arrival. The Ukrainian president's position is strengthened by the reality on the ground. Despite Russia's territorial gains, the war has revealed significant weaknesses in Putin's military. The same army that NATO planners once feared could overrun Baltic capitals in 36 hours has struggled for months to capture individual Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has proven that it can resist Russian aggression, but only with continued Western support. Support that could be jeopardized if Trump cuts a separate deal with Putin. This is where the European response becomes critical. The joint statement from European leaders isn't just diplomatic politeness, it's a signal that Europe is prepared to continue supporting Ukraine even if the United States steps back. European nations have already pledged to maintain their substantial military and financial support for Ukraine and are discussing ways to provide security guarantees that could fill any gap left by American disengagement. The broader implications of this diplomatic standoff extend far beyond Ukraine. If Trump and Putin do reach an agreement that ignores Ukrainian and European concerns, it could fracture the Western alliance that has been the foundation of the response to Russian aggression. European leaders are already talking about taking greater responsibility for their own security and reducing dependence on American leadership, a shift that could reshape global geopolitics for decades. For Putin, this summit represents both an opportunity and a risk. On one hand, he gets the international legitimacy that comes from a face-to-face meeting with the American president, something he's been seeking for years. The Alaska location, while symbolically neutral, still represents Putin being received on American soil, which is a significant diplomatic victory for a leader who has been increasingly isolated internationally. On the other hand, Putin faces the challenge of managing expectations. He's presented his territorial demands as non-negotiable, but if the summit fails to produce an agreement, he'll have to explain to the Russian people why their costly war continues. The Russian economy is under severe strain from sanctions, and public support for the war, while still majority, has shown signs of erosion as casualties mount and economic horror. D-ships increase. For Trump, the summit is a chance to deliver on his campaign promise to end the war quickly. But Zelensky's rejection of the premise undermines Trump's ability to claim success. Even if Trump and Putin reach an agreement, it will be meaningless if Ukraine continues fighting and Europe continues supporting Ukrainian resistance. Trump risks being seen as having been played by Putin if he agrees to terms that don't actually end the conflict. The human cost of this diplomatic maneuvering cannot be ignored. Every day the war continues, more Ukrainian civilians and soldiers die. Cities continue to be bombed, infrastructure continues to be destroyed, and families continue to be torn apart. The pressure for peace is real and understandable, but Zelensky's position reflects the hard lesson that Ukraine has learned over 3 years of war. Peace without justice is not sustainable peace. This lesson is rooted in Ukraine's historical experience with Russia. Previous agreements, from the Budapest Memorandum that was supposed to guarantee Ukrainian security in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, to the Minsk agreements that were supposed to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine, were all violated by Russia when it suited Putin's purposes. From Ukraine's perspective, any new agreement that doesn't include strong enforcement mechanisms and genuine consequences for violations will just give Putin time to prepare for the next attack. As we look toward Friday's summit, the question isn't just whether Trump and Putin can reach an agreement. It's whether any agreement they reach will actually end the war. Zelensky's defiant response suggests that Ukraine is prepared to continue fighting, rather than accept what they see as a capitulation disguised as peace. European leaders are signaling they'll support Ukraine's choice. This sets up a potential scenario where Trump and Putin announce a deal that Ukraine rejects, leaving the war to continue despite American efforts to end it. The stakes couldn't be higher. This summit could either mark the beginning of the end of Europe's largest conflict since World War II, or it could deepen the divisions within the Western alliance and prolong Ukrainian suffering. Zelensky's message is clear. Ukraine won't be a passive observer in decisions about its own fate. Whether Trump and Putin are listening remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Ukraine's fight for sovereignty and territorial integrity is far from over, regardless of what happens in Alaska this Friday.